Good evening to everyone. I welcome you all to today's discussion on the topic gauging the impact of French presidential elections across Europe, even as the elections are poised at an interesting turn. Just a brief primer before we start on how the French elections are conducted in the interest of the wider audience. When the French people go to polls, if no candidate wins over 50% of the vote, a second round is organized, and only two candidates with the most votes qualify for the second round. The candidate with absolute majority of the votes cast is elected then. Now, if you look at the politics of France, France embraces itself for the presidential election at a time of great uncertainty and conflict, which is also brewing in Europe. The first round of elections was conducted on April 10, bringing presidential candidate, also the President Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, face to face once again since the candidature in 2017. The French president won 27.6% of the votes at the end of the first round, while his rival, Marine Le Pen, garnered 23.4%. Now, the current circumstances starkly vary in comparison to the elections in 2017, primarily due to the ongoing war in Ukraine, which has now become a fundamental factor for the French citizens. While multiple polls suggest that President Macron should retain his presidency, Le Pen is likely to close in, thereby opening French and European politics to new scenarios and possibilities in the future. The first round of elections, as I said, has also dented the aspirations of former ruling parties, as both the Socialist and the La Républicains candidate received less than 5% of votes. The outcome of the French elections could play a monumental role at a time when Europe, NATO, and European Union are seeking stability and progress to counter Russia. So this is a discussion being held on the topic by Observer Research Foundation. And we have, to do that, we have an excellent set of panelists today. Let me briefly introduce the guests before I invite them to make their observations on the topic. We have first Professor Umu Salma Bawa, who's a professor at the Center for European Studies. She is also, as she was also the Jean Monnet Chair for the EU Security, Peace and Conflict Resolution at JNU in Delhi. We also have Dr. Jean-Yves Camus, who's a specialist on French and European radical right, and also serves as the director of Observatory for Radical Politics. We have Mathilde Kiola, who's the program coordinator of the Paris office of European Council on Foreign Affairs, on Foreign Relations, pardon me. And finally, we have Rahul Kamath, who is a research assistant with the Observer Research Foundation. So it makes for a great panel on this topic, and I'm glad to have all of you together on one screen. With that, let me invite Professor Bawa for her initial remarks on how does she look at the French elections, how interestingly is it poised, and what are the chances for Macron and Le Pen, and also in terms of the overall evolution of foreign policy of France. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Vivek, and very happy to be with such good panelists over here. So my initial take on this, of course, when you look at it, it appears to be a rematch of the 2017 elections, but that is, just on top of the curve. Let me break it down into 4 or 5 different points in terms of the question that you've asked. One is the political landscape, and what we're seeing today, I think, is also borne out by my other panelists, would be there's a pivotal turn happening in French politics. So the kind of the political spectrum that you see, in that you will notice the shift of the needle on the political axis to the further right has taken place, especially since the first round of elections took place on 10th of April. What does that tell you? A lot about how the traditional parties have been left bruised and struggling to be visible, with having even less than 10% of the votes cast, and a dramatic shift happening within the population of a country, in a larger context, of course, where war has returned in a very emphatic manner to Europe. So while foreign policy never makes it to the domestic issues in terms of elections, the start of these elections in the very beginning was actually framed by the foreign policy before domestic issues once again reclaim that political space, which commonly happens in any elections. A second point which you would see over here is what have the political parties done in terms of managing, the perceptions of the population. After all, when you come back for elections, it is renegotiating the social contract for the period of time. In the case of France, is 5 years. And how is it that the people make sense of what has transpired in the outgoing presidency, and what is it that they're looking forward? So one could ask it and pose it in the frame of, has President Macron done a good job at perception management, or has the contender from the formerly Front National and now the renamed political party, has Marine Le Pen managed to actually convince the voters that she is not what she is, and her packaging and marketing is going to be far more successful? And I think the votes talk about that. Closing the gap is one which we have seen. So and a third critical point over here is, like, how do you find relevance in the current political context when the old problems continue to exist, and the war is still raging on in Europe. There's no end in sight. In fact, one would say that there's a regrouping which is happening, and I will shift to foreign policy on that. My second point is, a couple of points on Macron, the current president. If he wins the second round, then it would be, in fact, after a gap of time that this is happening, probably 2002. So it's not going to be a cakewalk for Macron. One can notice he's hitting the campaign trails to get the numbers, and there's a big difference between his strategy and his opponent at this point. So translating words into action, both at the foreign policy level, has not paid a very rich dividend to Macron at the domestic level, which has encountered issues of, where the Yellow Vest movement, reform in the pension scheme, and all of this brought attention to the purchasing power going down, and social justice becoming an important issue over there. So in this context, how good has he been in managing the perception, problem, or the perception deficit? Then one would say that there is definitely a gap between what the people see, what the politicians are talking about, and what the people perceive on the street. The extreme right, therefore, they're picked up on issues like immigration and Islam, which I'm sure Dr. Kamas will talk about more, so I'm not going to get into that. But it's also an important point to see here that when you look at the number of votes polled by the extreme right, in that sense, Marine Le Pen and the others, then we're looking at a substantial number which is happening over here, which is also important to talk about how politics is reconfiguring and reshaping itself in France. So at this point, as the field has cleared out between the 12 candidates and only 2 are left in the fray, as is the case in France for the second round of runoff, it's really cut to the chase now. You have the existing president, reaching out to the population, saying that, all your policies are, of course, taken a backseat. The COVID has done that. The economy needs to be brought back on trail. Still will push ahead with some of the issues. On the other hand, it's very interesting how, one of the other contenders of the far-right rivals, Eric Zemmour, the way that card played out, is interesting that in contrast to that, Marine Le Pen appears to be far more moderate. So it's very interesting that when you get a variation on the political spectrum, how, the cleavaging can take on a new kind of a shape. So she has, of course, toned down her rhetoric. She has brought down that she's not going to be exiting the European Union or the Schengen or the Euro currency. But, all that, what remains as a fact is that her backdrop is that she is an extremely Eurosceptic person. And so what does that mean when it plays out in terms of who will get access to power? Let me just conclude on the third point over here for the first round, and that is the role of media in building up candidates. Why the presence of a free and fair media is extremely important, and why I think the building up of France's extreme right candidate, Eric Zemmour, was also very much played out by the media, and maybe Dr. Kamas would, come on that. I think in terms of how perceptions are managed and played out, it becomes extremely important. Somebody who could have been a non-candidate comes in to become a candidate. And then, of course, now the benefit of that would play out for Le Pen. In the past, there has been a rallying around to kind of find the middle ground so as to prevent a totally going off the political rails in French elections. We've seen when second round, playoffs have taken place. Voter apathy in a democracy is something which even France is having to contend about, and that is an important point over here. A lesser voter turnout would mean that President Macron can get the benefit of that, and Marine Le Pen has pointed out that that could be one of her biggest problems in converting what she feels is reaching out to the working class and reaching out to them, but actually getting them in to vote would be an extremely important point. As we speak, the former French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, has given his endorsement to Macron, and you will now clearly see in the next remaining days, as we are, less than 10 days away, there will be the call from the different groups to support one or the other candidate, and thereby to close the gap between the field. So I think we're looking at one is a very interesting turn from a political science point of view to what is happening to French democracy. Second is a third attempt by Marine Le Pen to get into the presidency. Does she make it or break it? Third, the big shadow of the war in Europe, which is going to impact on foreign policy as rising prices and cut back on social welfare, and not even out of the pandemic, but looking at how this will impact, can all mean that it's the final bit to manage the perception of the voter. So let me stop here.
Thank you, ma'am. I think a lot of points were made there. I'll come back to you. But let me now move to Dr. Camus and ask him, sitting in Paris, how is the situation evolving, particularly in terms of the second round? Last time, in the last elections, the presidential debate actually turned out to be a doomsday for Le Pen. How does it look this time for the second round, and what are the issues at play? And also a follow-up question on the issue of other parties. Why did other parties really did not do as well as expected? Over to you, sir.
Good morning, good evening, sorry. I would like to stress 2 or 3 points with regard to the election. First of all, as this is the third time Marine Le Pen stands for president, this is the second time she's on the second round. She already was in 2017, and her father was in 2002. What we have been watching since the mid-80s is a constant rise in support for the former National Front. In 2002, Le Pen Senior polled 17%. In 2017, Marine Le Pen polled 33% on the second round. My expectations are based on the many surveys we have, is that she can pull up to 45, 48%. Most presumably, she will lose the election to Macron because there's still something of, I used to call that a Republican front against the extreme right, but it should not be taken for granted. The opinion surveys left today say that Macron could win by a very narrow majority of 51 to 49 or 52 to 48, with a slight possibility that Marine Le Pen can even win if she gets enough support from the most voters who actually, I think, 80% of them will vote for Le Pen in the second round. And also, there are big issues regarding the far left. The radical left candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a former Socialist Party member, polled very well, over 21%. He failed to go on the second round, but it was a very, very short failure. And to make it simple, the far left candidate says that we want no more of Macron. We do not want 5 years more. He said that personally he will not vote for Le Pen, which means that he probably either will vote for Macron or leave a blank ballot in a box. But I mean, the average voters who went to the far left first round are people who are so much angry at the elites and at the president, who do not trust the mainstream political parties anymore, who so badly want to change society and stand against the EU, stand against neoliberalism, that, well, many of them, up to 25%, may vote for Le Pen just because they want to change, just because they want Macron out. I mean, this is not sane, well, that's my opinion. It's not good, but that's the way it is. So if Marine Le Pen succeeds in mobilizing, as she's trying to do right now, a very broad array of people from all parts of the political spectrum, on the only grounds that we must stop with Macron and have another kind of public policies and government, including changing the constitution, well, there's a very slight possibility that she may win, which of course would have many consequences, not only in France, but also on our foreign policy and on our partners in the EU. Marine Le Pen she used to say, and we will get out of the EU. That was called Frexit, on the same basis as Brexit. Since 2017, she's changed in mind and said, well, we will not leave, or at least will not leave at the start of my term. I will wait for the end of my term, and then at the end of it, I will call a referendum and ask the French people what they want to do, remain or leave. Her model right now is not living, is staying without abiding to common legislation. It's quite the liberal model that exists in Poland and Hungary. I mean, she's very much influenced by the policies of the Polish and Hungarian government. And well, I mean, most of the voters, I think, are now thinking that we should remain, gain substantial benefits from being in the EU, but that we should go back to some national sovereignty on finances, on foreign policy, and on the rule of law. I mean, that's exactly what's happening in Warsaw and Budapest. Another very important topic is that Marine Le Pen is not only against the EU. It's something very interesting that in the French, on the French extreme right, strong opposition to NATO. It's a very specific French. It's a French specificity. You have to mind that back in the 1960s, when General de Gaulle was in power as president, he pursued the third way policy of having France, I would say, stay away from both, of course, the communist bloc, but also from NATO and the United States. In actually 1965, he withdrew France from the military end of NATO. And within the French extreme right, and within the French extreme right, you have a substantial part of the voters who say, okay, we should not be subservient to any foreign power, including the United States and including NATO. So that's the second kind of consequences. The third point with regard to foreign policy is, of course, what took place when the confrontation between the Ukraine and Russia began. Marine Le Pen used to be very close to Russia, and she once met in 2017 with Vladimir himself. She got a loan from a Russian bank to finance the party. She's getting money from Hungary as well. That's totally public. So she used to say, well, the interest of France is in a very strong relationship with Russia, not only because of geopolitics, but because the Russian politics of Putin are very interesting. The National Rally thinks that Putin is a strong-handed man, which he is, of course, but also that Russia is faithful to the traditional values of Christianity, patriotism, having a strong leader, the traditional family, trying to influence its neighborhood and so on. So it's some kind of a model of traditional European values that Marine Le Pen thinks we in Western Europe do not retain anymore. So that's not regard to Russia and the national France. That's not a matter of getting money. It's also a matter of staying on the same political line than united Russia and the Russian leadership. But once Russia invaded the Ukraine during the campaign, Marine Le Pen very smartly and very quickly understood that it was not possible to be elected and say, well, Putin is a fine guy, and I mean, these are the bad guys, and Russia is totally right in invading the country. So she all of a sudden shifted to, well, this is a Russian invasion. Russia is wrong, and we should accommodate refugees from the Ukraine. They moved to a totally different approach, which, in my opinion, cost him many, many votes. He waited for 1 week before saying, well, yes, in fact, the Russians are too strong-handed. They are not totally wrong, but I mean, not way. And as for refugees, well, if they are in Poland, that's very good. But if they want to come to France, well, we could accommodate some. So particularly Marine Le Pen was very, very clever. But it doesn't change the reality of things. I mean, if she gets into power, the old friendship with Russia will, of course, come front. And I mean, there's a very strong possibility that she wants to reestablish this connection with Moscow, which, of course, would be a very, very serious blow to the credibility of France on the international scene. So my prediction is, as of today, a narrow win by Emmanuel Macron. And this very narrow win means that over the last 5 years, mainstream political parties and the president himself either did not dare taking the National Front seriously, or, I mean, try to do something to contain the National Front vote, but failed.
Thank you, Dr. Kamu. I think some great, interesting points there, especially on NATO and a whole lot of issues, including immigration, etc. And I think most of us would go with your prediction, but these are elections, and there is a crystal ball question. But let me, before I come to you again, let me move to Mathilde. Thank you for joining. You were also sitting in Paris. And especially on the question of foreign policy, there has been, a scramble by the French president on issues of foreign policy. He has spoken to Vladimir Putin, perhaps the most number of times any European leader has, and he has been very vocal about it on social media and other places. And when cornered about the question about the fact that Putin, his diplomacy did not have any sway on Putin, he actually he has come to a sort of a defense. So how do you look at issues of foreign policy for Macron in this election, especially vis-a-vis relations with Poland, which is sort of deteriorating now, issues of immigration, and the looming war of Ukraine and Russia. How do you see the second round shaping up? Over to you, Matteo.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I think, first of all, I'd like to come back maybe on the campaign and on the impact of foreign policy in this campaign. So foreign policy is not usually at the top of priorities during a campaign. It's not really debated, as it's not debated in the kind of normal political debate in France. It's very much like kind of elite and expert thing. But for once, it has been at the center of the debate, and I think it started already back in August and September with Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also with AUKUS and the pact that costs submarines to France. And so it has been in the center, and obviously the war in Ukraine that started at the end of February was the main topic of this campaign. That was very, very unusual. And it also comes from the fact that the different candidates had very different positions, as the former speakers were saying, on Ukraine and on Russia. So obviously, at the first stages of the war, we saw a rise of support in the polls for Emmanuel Macron, and I think that came from the rallying behind the flag effect, obviously, of having a war in Europe. So national unity and all of this. Also came from the fact that I think French people didn't see any other candidate as actually able to manage this and to manage a war and to be able to represent France in organizations and in the EU. And the fact that Macron went and speak more than any other leader to Vladimir Putin, I think also worked in his favor. But I think the second factor is also the positioning of the different candidates. As we were saying before, obviously Marine Le Pen, we all know that she has links to Russia, that she has very, very cleverly managed to kind of put on the back foot during the whole campaign. And as Jean-Yves Camille was saying just before, Éric Zemmour, who's the only one that doubled down on his support to Putin, crumbled and lost a lot of support in the polls. So I think this is the main fact about the campaign, and this is the real eruption of foreign policy into the domestic debate that is not usually the case. Then I think if we look at now the debate between the two candidates, obviously I would say that once more foreign policy is not going to be why people will vote for one or the other. Obviously it counts, and I think the links to Putin that Marine Le Pen has been continuing to have will count. But I think mostly people will vote on social issues and domestic issues. So even if this will feature in the debate, I think the purchasing power that Marine Le Pen has been campaigning on for the past few months, already before the war, might have an impact. And I think this is the kind of issues that she will try and put on this at the center of the debate to make sure that maybe her links to Putin are not too often mentioned too often. I think if we continue looking at this issue, Marine Le Pen has been saying in the past few weeks that she would have kind of done the same diplomatic effort as Macron has been doing in the past few years with Putin, which kind of is the kiss of death, as you would say in French, for Macron, because I mean his policy is now, approved by the far right and approved by someone that is really linked to Putin, and he has been criticized by the European allies for his 2019 rapprochement with Putin and his will of engaging and continuing dialogue with Russia, and has been criticized. So it's a bit difficult, I think, for now. The second thing, you were talking about Europe, and I think this is very important, because when in 2017 we said that it was a campaign between a pro-European and an anti-European, I think it's a bit different now. Obviously, she's super Eurosceptic. It's nothing to be said about that, but she's not as anti-European as she used to be, or not in the same way. As Jean-Yves Camille was saying, there's no talk about Frexit anymore. So she wants to stay in the EU, and she wants to change it from within. She wants to use institutions and frameworks for France's national interest, which will always come first in her strategy. So I think the Europe of nations is in front of the European Union, the usual European Union, in the way that we see it, and in the way that Macron has been working for the past few years. Strategic autonomy and sovereignty narratives that he has been pushing that are starting to really take on in Europe, in other European member states. It's really a different narrative, but it's not an anti-European narrative anymore. She has allies in the EU, which maybe didn't have so much before. Obviously, she's very close to Orban's in Hungary and to Kaczynski in Poland, and she will use that. And she's already said that she will not use the Franco-German relation as it has been used in the past. She'll. I mean, we were talking about NATO and defense just before, and she's been saying quite bluntly that she will stop any defense project that has been ongoing with Germany. So maybe the FCAS, the airplanes, and that she wants to have industrial power in France more than like shared with the German allies. So this will obviously mean a change of balance in coalitions in the EU. She will go towards Hungary and Poland, and I think she will. She feels vindicated by their victory, by Vucic's victory too, and she will, I think, legitimize also maybe other countries that have maybe been a bit more on the back foot, and she might help those narratives to be more hard and stronger in the EU. Maybe, and then I'm sure we'll come back on foreign policy more in detail, but I think it's two different visions of foreign policy that are at stake here in the second round. Macron has been saying that he wants to be the champion of multilateralism when she clearly wants to work more on a bilateral basis. Obviously, she knows that the world is one where multilateralism counts, but she's acknowledging, she's maybe suggesting that there's a multipolar world where the great power narrative is reinforced again, and that she will prefer bilateral relations to multilateral institutions. And that's also why she wants to kind of leave the NATO integrated command that she's been pushing for. I'll maybe stop now, but we can come back on maybe the debates that will happen on foreign policy. Once again, I think foreign policy is important because France is a big actor of foreign policy, but I don't think that French voters will vote according to foreign policy. I think domestic issues are going to be way more important than foreign policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Mathilde. I think we all got clear insights about foreign policy and the importance of foreign policy in French elections this time. I want to take the question about the Franco-German alliance later on to Professor Bawa, but first let me come to Rahul and get his interventions on how is he keenly watching the French elections? What does it mean for perhaps the Indo-Pacific or other issues of foreign policy? But also feel free to speak on some of the domestic issues that you've watched. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vivek. I hope I'm audible, and it's wonderful to be on the panel. For analyzing the French elections, I did try taking a unique approach by going through what Marine Le Pen had to say on Twitter, and her like all the panelists before me have mentioned that her rhetorics and her words have changed significantly from 2017 to what it is right now. And I think that has played an important role in her receiving 24% of the votes, and even The speculated poll suggests that she would be able to get around 49% of the votes. And the change of words, the change of stance, like as previously mentioned, she was she's still Eurosceptic, but right now she does not want to leave the European Union, or she does not want to leave the Eurozone. But while saying that, she wants to cut down France's contribution to the European Union by almost 50%, and then introduce reforms and structural reforms that could single-handedly, become a threat to the European single market. And I think the change of rhetorics has worked to her to some extent, because if you see the demographics of vote that she's received, the rural and suburban areas have been a major factor in her resurgence. And she has been able to build on the same rhetoric by suggesting that if she is elected as the president of the Republic of France, then she would be willing to establish something called Ministry of Ruralities to protect the interest of rural population. Now come to that point where Macron has not proactively rallied as much as Marine Le Pen has rallied, and his interest leans towards the French and European foreign policy. Le Pen has kind of extremely smartly and diligently used this to her advantage and used this as a leverage to focus on the social issues and the domestic issues. And she has often mentioned that she would use protectionist measure and implement the Buy France policy and reduce the retirement age to 60, and decrease the VAT to from 20% to 5.5%. And all of this comes in a time where there's an inflation in France and there's a youth unemployment. And this rhetoric has kind of worked in her favor. That has received a lot of votes for her. And now she's also expanding. She aims to spend about $2 billion to raise the salaries of hospital workers and expand the public healthcare sector. So that could be that could be one of the most important factors in terms of domestic policy for France. And then the more controversial part of it would be how the right wing has been rising in Europe since the 2014 migration crisis. In 2017, the major issue was the migration crisis, between how France handled the migration. Right now, the situation is all about Ukraine and how European countries and how European Union would deal with the Ukrainian crisis. In such a scenario, Viktor Orban, just a few days ago, he was re-elected and he won his election, and Marine Le Pen was one of the first European leaders to congratulate him. And she's often mentioned that she would tie up with Viktor Orban or leaders in Poland to make sure that they weaken the European Union from within. And that's something that could be kind of, a point of threat for the European Union as well as NATO. I think in one of her recent interviews, she mentioned that, she identifies herself as a Gaullist. Now, if you go through what, the General de Gaulle had did in 1960s, his idea was France would not be a subordinate power to anyone and it would be its own power. And in similar way, she wishes to, withdraw the NATO command and create a whole new security itself so that France remains extremely, self-sustained and not dependent on anyone. And now, with regards to the energy crisis or the, the sanctions that the European Union and other Western powers have put on Russia, she's often said that, the sanctions are not going to work because France depends on oil and gas imports, not as much as other countries, but still it depends enough. And she would make sure that French interest comes ahead of any European interest. Now, that is a major factor of how, the people would look at it and how the rural population and the suburban population look at it. There was always a rhetoric and a narrative that Macron is more of, a leader of Paris, not leader of France. And this is something kind of has worked to Le Pen's favor. And she has been building more and more on it. And I think that could be a very a turning point in how the elections would go through. And then you have the other issues of, identifying the domestic sector, which domestic sector would she focus on and which foreign policy is her foreign policy good enough to, meet Macron's. Yes, probably in an election scenario, foreign policy would not matter as much as domestic policy. And this is something where I think she has done extremely smart move from her 2017 campaign till now, because Macron has not, rallied enough, and he's been focusing on the foreign policy issue. While we also have to notice or take in consideration that his last 5 years we witnessed a lot of protests like the Gilets Jaunes movement, or his vaccine mandate, where it was compulsory to show your vaccination certificates in public. That did work, that increased the vaccination rates, but at some point it also did not resonate with the minorities. And on the other hand, like while he is a Europhile, you could say, and he has pushed for like a stronger strategy in Indo-Pacific, considering France considers itself as a regional power in the Indo-Pacific because of the Reunion Islands and the French Pacific Islands. Uh, Regarding that, and then he's also focused on creating something called European sovereignty or European strategic autonomy. Now this came into picture after the Afghanistan crisis, and now you have the Ukraine war. And how do we, and right now we also know the France is in the presidency of the EU. His main goal was creating this something called European sovereignty or European autonomy. Now this is important for EU as a bloc to make sure that it's not dependent on Washington or any other power. But while we go about the Ukraine crisis or the Ukraine war, it's not possible for them. It's not possible for Macron to do it alone. He needs, a group of members, a group of other member states to agree on him. So that's why, like one of the reasons why strategic autonomy is unable to achieve is because, Macron is the only one and probably other few countries who are supporting him. And then if Le Pen comes into power, the whole question of, could EU be self-sufficient? Could EU achieve its strategic autonomy goes into a bigger picture, and there's a lot of uncertainty regarding that, whether it's possible, whether it's not possible. Because we don't know what Marine Le Pen's foreign policy would be. Yes, she has history of, aligning with Mr. Vladimir Putin and taking loans and, like even when the annexation of Crimea happened in 2014, she did not condemn the annexation, and she was neither in support of it but did not say anything regarding that. And that was one of the main reasons why voters in 2017, used that as one of the other reasons. But right now, I think there is no mention of foreign policy about how Marine Le Pen would approach, say, Indo-Pacific or engage in ties with countries like India or, US or Australia. Like, we have no mention about that. Whereas Macron for a longer time, like, has been, trying to achieve, be the champion of multilateralism while engaging, in bilateral ties with both India as well as, other countries. So I think that is a question of how Marine Le Pen, if she wins the elections and if she comes into power, how would she go about, handling the foreign policy? So that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Rahul. Yeah, I think there was quite a good lineup of issues concerning foreign policy on either side, on Le Pen and as well as Macron. Let me quickly bring that question which came out of Mathilde's response to Professor Bava. What is happening if Le Pen comes to power? What happens to and what shift does the relations between France and Germany? How does that look? Because particularly in the light of the fact that Germany is moving towards a rearmament of sorts in the background of Ukraine crisis, and here is the internal Franco-German relations, particularly on the issues of defense, getting prickly. That, and secondly, the whole issue of treating Le Pen, trying to treat the bilateral issues more than multilateral. What does it mean for the overall outlook for of France, in not just in Europe but in the Indo-Pacific?
So I think if anybody's been a long-term observer of the European Union, they would say that the key word in that is the Franco-German cooperation. It's called the Franco-German driver. So it's a double-engined train, which is always, when France and Germany come together, then the integration process has always moved. So finding that right balance has been very important. And they are the two founding leaders of European integration. One should not forget that. This does not mean to say that ups and downs have not taken place in the relationship. I think there have been, it's not one homogeneous whole. In the recent years, one should not forget that Macron also had put forward the idea of a new alliance for multilateralism, which found endorsement in Berlin, and then has grown much larger to a global level. So I think the French commitment, at least under Macron, to multilateralism, to working with Germany, found a kind of a secure space over there. The challenge is what happens if there is a shift in next week in the political process and Marine Le Pen should win. I think one has to also take on board the difference between articulating an idea when one is contesting elections and then actually, moving along with policy when you come into office. The fact that in the face of an extreme further right, there was a moderation in Le Pen's, articulation on the EU showed the amount of adjustment she was willing to make. Not only in terms of looking at the European Union as a space where, of course, she could work from within, but also, it's almost a 180-degree turn from the position of leaving EU, leaving the Schengen, leaving the, even the common currency, the euro, and now saying that, we will work with it. So I think there is also that point about how leadership will make pragmatic turns. If she wins, it's not going to be a cakewalk, and it doesn't mean that Scholz and Marine Le Pen would find it easy to walk across. I think the challenge would become far more acute because the two countries seem to take the lead, would be confronted by an even more, accentuating vertical and a horizontal divide. Because this will come at a time when on the horizontal plane, you've got Orban just winning the elections, reinforcing his cooperation with Moscow, willing to even undertake trade, bypassing Brussels. And Le Pen would become one of the other voices. Now, remember, there's a cleavaging on this also between the Visegrad Four, who have been seen to be more sympathetic and soft. And also there have been a derailment of democracy in the Visegrad Four countries. And so it would be interesting that if Le Pen wins, then would France join this derailment of democracy, right? And I would not like to put it that way, because if you take a much larger view of what's happening in Europe, then across the political landscape, there has been an increasing number for right of center, right? I mean, look at Germany itself. The AfD has come out of nowhere and readjusted to becoming the largest, in the previous election was the largest opposition party and continues to be there. So these are the kind of things you will see. So it's a probability in terms of guessing how much of the shift away from the line which France has stood for will happen. And if that should be the case, there will be definitely a tweaking on the foreign policy, which will be evident. But France has also experienced two things. It has got the benefits of having a robust, bilateral relation. At the same time, also enjoying the dividends which has come from integration. So having had the best of both worlds, one doesn't see France quickly exiting from this kind of an benefit. But the immediate attention in terms of the post-election scenario would be, of course, definitely a part would be the domestic politics to address the rising prices, the concerns of every day. But the war will definitely be on the table for whoever is the next president. So let me stop there.
Dr. Kamu, I would like to bring you on the issue of several readjustments that have been made by Le Pen on various issues. How do you see the issues of immigration, particularly as the war rolls on in Europe, and there's going to be more, hopefully not immigrants into Poland and thereby in more of Europe. What are the factors do you see still Le Pen readjusting with? And again, going back to the question of over-promising and the gap between promising and delivery, how do you assess that if she goes on to win?
That is a very important issue, because you have to remind the kind of policy she wants to implement with regard to immigration if she is elected. According to the party, all immigrants, all foreign people who are not documented should be deported to their native countries. All people who received a sentence, not only a prison, but some sentence for serious offenses, and who are foreign nationals will be deported. Those who are suspect of being radicals, most of them, of course, Muslim radicals, will be deported. The very big problem is that, according to French law, anyone who is not documented should be more or less automatically expelled and sent back to his native country. But at the present time, only 10% of those foreigners who are not documented and who have a court order to leave, only 10% of them are really deported to their own country. Why? Because their own countries do not want to receive them. So basically, they are stuck here. They are not documented. They are ordered to leave. But as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, or the African countries in the Sahel do not want them to come back, I mean, they just stay here. Some of them in a it's not a prison, it's not a camp, but anyway, it's some kind of specific facility. So please imagine if man wants to expel all those people, and that's potentially millions of people. It's totally impossible. It's not a matter of complying with legislation of the EU. It's not a matter of human rights at all. It's just that technically it's absolutely impossible, unless you really want to move from a democratic country to a dictatorship, which I think that is wise enough to not consider. So there's a very big possibility that voters will get defeated if she wins, because they will see very soon that she cannot deliver. On social issues, of course, Marine Le Pen focused on topics that have to do with the pocketbooks of French people, rising the minimum wage, retiring at 62 and now 65. That's the way Macron wants people to retire. He wants them to retire at 65. Most people are very strongly against this. Marine Le Pen says, well, it will be 62. I mean, that's a real problem. If you want to have a better minimum wage, and I think that's a very wise move. If you want to retire at 62, and this is a very wise move, you have to get money. You have to get money. And at this time, unless we really drift from the policies of the EU and let our national budget drift to much more than the 3% deficits, that is, I mean, more or less EU, I mean, you're not able to spend money just like this and tell people, wow, this is the time of promises and I will deliver everything. And I think another problem is that, I mean, on the right of Marine Le Pen, Zemmour will still be there. I mean, he's only polled 7 point something, but he's just starting. I mean, quite frankly, quite honestly, this guy was not even a candidate in November. He had no political party by June 5th. So he's just in the starting blocks, and we will have elections too in June and maybe even in May. So there's a very good possibility that he will gain some importance in the political landscape. And this is despite the fact that his policies on immigration and identity are very much more to the right, more much ethno. Well, I do not want to say he has an ethnic vision of French society. It's not very far from that. So there are still possibilities that something will emerge on the right of Marine Le Pen, and I do not even know if she will choose to run for a fourth time in 2027. That should not be taken for granted. Final word, when Marine Le Pen says we should close the doors on immigration, it means close the door on all kind of non-European immigration, not only Muslim. It goes as well for people from the Indian subcontinent. She does not say anything about Chinese people, who account for at least half a million people, half a million documented people. But anyway, that means closing the doors on everyone who does not come from, well, basically from ethnically Western Christian countries.
I'll come back to you on that point. Sorry to cut you short, but we just have a few minutes left. But I think there was an interesting point on which I want to take to Mathilde about Marine Le Pen not speaking about Chinese immigrants. And I also want to link this up with other issue of something that Professor Bauer spoke about. You know, the question of decay of democracy. Le Pen is being seen as close to countries that are not so democratically high up on the ladder as per assessments. How do you see, how is it playing out in the second round of elections?
Thanks. Maybe just before that, I just wanted to complement something that Rahul said. She mentioned India actually when she said that she wanted to have more country on the having a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, and she mentioned India as one of them. She's also very conscious that this is a very difficult thing to do in the UN, but she might push for that. Second thing about Asia, she's not talking about the Indo-Pacific, but she talked about Asia-Pacific, and she said that she wanted to get closer to Japan, Korea, and other countries. So I don't really know what it means, but she wants to have more links to countries in the Asia-Pacific, is what she calls it. And I think this is driven by her like kind of principles on foreign policy, which would be independence, equidistance, and consistency, meaning that she will not align with the US nor with China, and she wants to be able to talk on a bilateral basis to a lot of different countries. On China, she mentioned it also very short, I mean, in a short statement, but just saying that she wants to make sure that China respects international law and maritime law. She's also saying that if France goes back to being close with Russia, it's to make sure that Russia doesn't ally with China. That's her main line, and she's been saying that for years actually, and that's also why she says that she agrees with Macron's politic of going back to doing the rapprochement with Russia. She wants to make sure that Russia doesn't ally with China and like forms an other bloc. On the democracy question, I mean, what she's been showing is directly going to these illiberal democracies that we've been seeing in Orban's Hungary and Kaczynski's Poland. She's been already saying that she's, for example, on press independence, freedom of press, she's been saying that, like a few days ago, that she is able to decide who is a journalist and who is not, because she has been banning some journalists from some outlets that she doesn't like to some of her rallies. So she's already kind of doing it as a politician and would definitely continue doing it as a leader. As France's leader. So yeah, she would for sure go towards this kind of democracy and go less into what's been France's democracy.
Thank you. Interesting point there, Rahul. I was expecting Marine Le Pen to sort of pivot away from the Asia-Pacific theater to more to Indo-Pacific, given what happened with AUKUS, etc. But here she is pitching for Asia-Pacific and more in line with countries like Russia. Your thoughts?
I think one reason for that would be, like you mentioned, like I think AUKUS is one reason why I think it was considered as a major, a point of embarrassment for France. And then she moved towards creating, an Asia Pacific, you could say pivot or like a balance. But then again, the question remains like, how do you differentiate between Indo-Pacific versus Asia Pacific, and how does she understand, what is her understanding of, Indo-Pacific or Asia Pacific? I think that remains a major point of contention for her and her party if they, end up being in the power. And I think the last thing that I think would be I think the one point that I forgot to mention in the opening remark would be, if she comes to power and if she wins, it could change the European politics in significant way, because there are like select few countries who are yet to go into elections, like probably this year or next year. Like Poland is due for elections, and then there's Croatia, and then the European Parliament itself is due for election in 2024. So if there is, emergence of right wing in, say, France, which of course there has been emergence of right wing in, Hungary and Poland, but if there's also in one of the major powers, like say, France now, and what then happens to the European Union? What happens in, Strasbourg? What does the parliament change, and how does the parliament accept this change? And I think the whole future is in the hands of, it would be like an overstatement to say the whole future is in hands of the French elections. But a major power change could change the European governance for good or for better.
Thank you, Rahul. I think we have analyzed threadbare given the time constraints that we had today. And we have seen substantially on how the French foreign policy is likely to play out if Le Pen goes on to win this time and becomes lucky the second time. I had an interesting time discussing this issue. I wish we had more time to get back to a third round, especially with Professor Bava, Rahul, and two people in sitting in Paris. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Bava, Rahul, Mathilde, and Dr. Kamu. Thank you so much. We will get back to you about the publication. Thank you.